The What It Takes Radio Company presents another episode, perhaps another adventure in interesting ideas, a radio podcast to help you live better now. And today, walking the beach, smelling the battlefield, and the will of the warrior. Yeah, what could that be about on this 6th of June? Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. The sounds of reveille, which meant that soldiers and warriors and people who were involved in protecting others, defending freedom, it's time to get up and go to work, perhaps go to battle. This is the 6th of June, a memorable day, particularly for many of us in, you might say, the United States of America and the Western Hemisphere, and certainly those people in Europe. This was the day 80 years ago when soldiers from around the world, really, invaded the coast of France at Normandy, what was called the D-Day invasion, so that within a year they could free Europe from the Nazi tyranny. And we commemorate that today. And that's leading me to my thoughts for today that have some personal reflections. And we're going to talk about this: walking the beach, the smell of the battlefield, and the will of the warrior. Let's see where that will lead us today on Interesting Ideas. The program begins right now. Well, a number of you said you liked my hat, so I began with the hat. And I'll wear it from time to time. But you know, I'm also an old-fashioned guy. I really am. Oftentimes when I walk into a store or into a home, uh, for sure when I walk into church, I take off my hat because that's what my mother always told me to do. You know, I was walked in, you take off your hat. You know, gentlemen don't wear hats inside, Stanley Paul. And I still live that way. And so this is an important message, and I'm inside our little gathering here. So I'll wear my hat occasionally, but I thought well, we will take off my hat today. All right. Again, that's just kind of who I am. Here we go. This is one of my mementos. Yeah. It's a white rock. Well, almost 40 years ago. Yeah, 39 years ago, shortly after the commemoration of the 40th anniversary at Normandy, France, I actually had the opportunity, as we were stationed working in Europe at that time with a group of friends, and we went over to France and went to the beaches of Normandy. And I remember walking that beach. And that was an incredible memory, you know, and I even bought myself a little Michelin guide called The Battle of Normandy, which obviously I still have. And this is one of the rocks that I found on the beach. Of course, there were thousands of rocks. And I put it in my pocket. And I've made a lot of moves from Europe to America, to Arizona, back here to Carolina. But you know what? This is one of my mementos because it reminds me of the experience that I had as I walked on somewhat of a cloudy day, the battlefield at Normandy. And it had a little bit of a different feel. Just because I knew the experience there. You know, George Patton who was obviously the American soldier general who, after the Battle of Normandy, which he didn't have a great deal to do with, but of course, after the American troops landed in Normandy, he was the one who very much led the Third Army, which then liberated France and then went into Germany for the defeat of the Nazi German Empire at that time. In the story of Patton, wonderful movie, and again, many of you know that movie. In one of the scenes in North Africa when they're fighting that war, all of a sudden Patton stops. He said, tells his driver to stop. And well, there's nothing here. He said, oh yes, there is. And he gets out and he walks around. And he was quite a historian. And he said, no, this is where a great battle was fought. This is a battlefield. Remember, I can smell a battlefield. I can smell a battlefield. You know, maybe he could. But he actually knew that that was a location where a long forgotten, significant battle in ancient times was fought, and it was right there. And he was standing in the very place where, you know, thousands of men and soldiers had died in a very bloody battle. I can smell a battlefield. You know, those are things that struck me because I remembered that as I walked along that shore, and there was just a very strange feeling about the fact that you're right in the place where a great battle had taken place, where literally there were hundreds and over 2,000 men who died and bled to death on the very beaches and the sand I was walking in. It was obviously a very emotional experience. And then we then went up and walked through the cemetery that was there. And I remember it was Colin Powell who said that in honor of some of those situations, he said, remember, we as Americans have never gone to conquer anybody else's land, but we've been there to help protect other people and their land. And all we asked in return was a place to bury our dead. And I just have to admit that, you know, I had a strong sense of pride in all of that. Yeah. Walking the beach and smelling the battlefield. Actually, we had no other connection to that, except that my wife, Karen, who she introduced me to one of her great uncle George. And I found out he was a teacher, like I was a teacher, high school teacher. Well, I found out he was more than that. Actually, he had been a world champion in that sense, world champion in Minnesota, basketball player in 1940, and led his team to the state championship. Just a little guy, really good. He was drafted and landed up as a tank driver and landed up in Patton's army in Africa, then in Sicily, and then Normandy and Germany. He was the driver of a tank, and many, many close calls, lost friends, and in effect, he says, I met Patton 3 times. He said, and once he cursed at me, once he told me to get rid of the tank, that it needed to be repaired, and something else, but I forgot. He said he was quite a character. Uncle George came home alive, went back and became a teacher. That's how he spent all of his life, teaching young men and women. At first, he never wanted to talk about it. And he said, no, I don't want to talk about it. And I said, I'm a history teacher. it took me many years before he began, because he trusted me, and he started to tell his story about what had happened to him in the war. Most of the men didn't want to do that. And then finally, people actually began to know that George had been in the war. I mean, this teacher at Hibbing High School, where Bob Dylan had gone to school, and he began to be asked, and he began to, tell stories. Eventually, it was found out, and he was asked to actually go to Europe because the people, particularly in Holland, were fascinated by his story, and they wanted to honor him because he had helped to liberate Holland and the Dutch. And it was an incredible situation, and we knew him, and he had been. In fact, if any of you saw the movie Fury about a tank group of guys, it was actually very much he had been called then later. He got a call one day, and his wife said, "George, it's a guy called Brad Pitt wants to talk to you." And George said, "Well, who the hell is Brad Pitt?" He didn't know. And it was the very actor who was in Fury who had heard about George, and he wanted him to come to Hollywood and teach him about what he had learned so that he could better play the role in the movie. Yeah. And those were in. He recently passed away. And as most of them have by now. But I remember that, and a number of people came to me and said, "Stan, we're so glad that you finally took time to help Uncle George tell his story." I said, "Well, that's what I do. I help people tell their story." And it ended well. It ended very well. But here's the thought. We all have our little mementos and our thoughts. And so I would remember and ask you to remember, when you know situations of valor and goodness and courage, help those people tell their stories. Show an interest in them, particularly if they're older, like many of us are now, to capture those stories and to capture those memories. Remember, storytelling is oftentimes the only thing that gets preserved in human history. The books don't get written, the articles don't get published, but the stories can be passed on. And particularly now, guess how many more people know about it because they've watched my little podcast right now. So I would encourage you to do that. All right. But here's something else. I one time heard one of the soldiers say, he said, "Stan, most of us weren't real heroes. We were just scared to death. And we fought to save our own lives and save our friends and get home alive." We did some brave and courageous things, but we were just soldiers, good soldiers. He said, and some of us weren't even very good, But he said, but part of it was many of us were led by real warriors. Not everybody was a warrior, professional warrior. These were men who were tough. Sometimes you didn't like them because they were tough. But you know what? In the war, it was oftentimes the men who were the toughest, who were the warriors, who really made it possible, being the first ones to climb the wall, to lead us into battle, who oftentimes took the bullet first themselves. He said, I've always remembered the fact that, war is hell and it's terrible. But oftentimes what you may find, you'll find out that there are, and perhaps we all need, warriors in our world. Churchill once said, toward the end of the Second World War, he said, we can now sleep better at night because there are rough men who aren't sleeping. So perhaps we need to think about that and remember that. There is a group of men mostly men, but there are women, and they are what we would call, what the Indians would call, the 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 group, the caste of warriors. And sometimes we need to remember that we need to have, and sometimes we need to honor, sometimes rough and tough and rugged, and perhaps not necessarily very likable men and women. But in the really hard times of life and business, and certainly in war, occasionally we need to remember we were led by warriors. Just let that sit on your head for a while and think about that. And just ask yourself, from time to time, are you a warrior? You're not a good warrior. You're not a big warrior, not a pro warrior, but are there times in your life where you might have to act like one just a little bit? Because in the rough and tough and difficult situations of life, we need warriors. All the best and blessings to you, and we bless the memories not only of the warriors, but obviously the men and women and the families who paid dearly for oftentimes the success and the future that we have. All the best and blessings to them and their families. We can still pray for them and their families, and we should do that also in grateful memory for ourselves, and that the legacy we enjoy and endure because others weren't able to. Best and blessings. Bye for now.